capabilities, civilian space activities, and commercial space industry, and implications for the United States in the ongoing space competition. We'll start with Dr. Brian Alkire, Senior Operations Researcher at RAND Corporation. Dr. Alkire will analyze China's space capabilities that challenge U.S. space sovereignty. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Blaine Curcio, founder of Orbital Gateway Consulting. Mr. Curcio will provide an overview of China's commercial space industry growth and evaluate its domestic and international policies shaping the future of its commercial space sector. After that, we'll hear from Ms. Victoria Sampson, Chief Director of Space Security and Stability at the Secure World Foundation. Ms. Sampson will discuss China's efforts to strengthen space cooperation with other countries, as well as its positions on space governance in multilateral forum. Then we'll welcome Mr. David Cavasso, President of the Commercial Space Federation. Mr. Cavasso will assess how the U.S. commercial space sectors are performing in relation to China. And finally, we'll hear from Mr. Andrew Cox, President of Forespoke. Mr. Cox will assess China's rapid space advancements and what it means for U.S. national security. Thank you all very much for your testimony today. The Commission is looking forward to your remarks. I ask that you all keep your remarks to 7 minutes. And Dr. Alkire, we will begin with you.
Commissioner Kuiken, Commissioner Sims, other members of the Commission, thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in the panel today. China's leaders see preeminence in space as an important component of a strong country, a source of national pride, and key to a prosperous nation. People's Liberation Army writings from 2013 described space capabilities as strategically important for winning what they call informatized wars. And since that time, China has designated space as a warfighting domain, evolved its organization for space warfighting twice, and grown its space and counterspace capabilities at what General Whiting called a breathtaking pace. In the past 8 years, China has increased the number of satellites for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance by a factor of 6, which includes a 17-fold increase in the number of commercial satellites for that mission. China is the only country to operate a synthetic aperture radar satellite in geostationary orbit, which provides China with a persistent day-night all-weather capability to surveil large naval units transiting the Indo-Pacific region. China has also increased its number of communication satellites by a factor of 12, including the recent launch of 72 Project SatNet satellites into what will eventually be thousands of satellites to function as China's Starlink. China has expanded its launch industry and accelerated its launch pace, and is prioritizing a tactically responsive space launch capability that leverages several of its new mobile solid-fueled vehicles provided by a combination of China's established state-owned enterprise space companies, as well as newer entrants, albeit with several launch failures for those newer entrants. China has made similar progress in other space mission areas, and like the US, China is working to field space architectures that leverage resilience methods, such as the proliferation method associated with US Starlink and Chinese Project SatNet. With regards to counterspace, China has an operational direct descent anti-satellite missile system for low Earth orbit that the PLA trains to operate, and China likely has efforts underway to field a similar capability for the higher orbits. According to the Defense Intelligence Agency, China has ground-based laser weapons systems and a wide range of electronic warfare capabilities. China also has increased capability for on-orbit inspection and repair satellites in low Earth orbit and in geostationary orbit that have demonstrated complex maneuvers, and those capabilities could have dual use for counter-space operations. For instance, a repair satellite that is equipped with a robotic arm could be used to deliver irreversible attacks on satellites by permanently damaging their components, or reversibly attack satellites by reorienting the satellite and temporarily taking it off of its mission. And conceivably, this kind of satellite could also be used for defense against similar attacks. Hence, China potentially has a wide range of counterspace or dual-use capabilities that can flexibly be used for offense or defense with reversible or non-reversible modes of attack spanning multiple orbital regimes. This provides the People's Liberation Army commanders with flexible tools for crisis and escalation management. So why is China fielding these types of counterspace capabilities? It's fielding them because it perceives the U.S. as having high dependence on space for joint warfighting. But interestingly, there's growing evidence that China itself has growing dependence on space capabilities for joint warfighting, which is evident by the rapid increases in the space capabilities that we've seen. China depends on space capabilities to monitor the U.S. posture in the Indo-Pacific region. At a time of war, China would depend upon space for targeting with its missile capabilities and assessing damage of those attacks. China likely depends on space to enable a broad range of long-range fire capabilities in multiple domains. China may have less incentive to escalate warfare to space if the People's Liberation Army needs to preserve the space capabilities that it depends upon for its joint warfighting, and if the People's Liberation Army believes the United States can hold those capabilities at risk. I make 3 observations about how the U.S. should respond to these developments. First, this panel is about China's ambitions to dominate space. I think space dominance narrowly focuses attention on threats to satellites. I think the U.S. should take a broader approach that holistically considers threats, but also includes careful consideration for U.S. and Chinese dependencies on space for joint warfighting. What are the key dependencies that each side depends upon, and when during the conflict? Are there alternatives in other domains? What are the battlefield effects, and what are the expected responses of holding Chinese satellites at risk? The U.S. should seek to preserve the space capabilities it relies upon for the joint warfight and to hold at risk the space capabilities that China relies upon to achieve its military objectives. Second, systems that increase U.S. resilience challenge the People's Liberation Army's preferred approach to warfighting. The United States should continue to acquire space architectures or services from commercial space architectures that leverage methods of enhancing resilience, including proliferation and diversity methods. For instance, the U.S. should enhance the resilience of architectures to provide positioning, navigation, and timing services. Third and finally, I recommend equipping U.S. military commanders with capabilities that can be used to defend satellites that lack adequate resilience measures and flexibly hold at risk the capabilities that China is highly dependent upon for joint warfighting. The U.S. is going to need robust capabilities for space domain awareness and command and control, since they are foundational for space operations, and indeed those appear to be priorities today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alkire. Mr. Curcio.
Thank you very much to the Commission for the invitation. I'm very proud and honored to be here. So today I'm going to talk about 3 main topics. So the technology transfer and alignment of incentives across the entire government across the entire government in China with regard to their commercial space sector, how this has impacted talent development and the proliferation of talent across the space sector, and finally, how national government policies are broadening the playing field where commercial companies are allowed to act within the Chinese commercial space sector. So looking at technology transfer and the alignment of incentives across the whole of government, I'd like to give an example of the Changchun Institute of Optics and Precision Mechanics in China's northeast Rust Belt area of Changchun, Jilin province, and Changchun city specifically. There's a company, Changguang Satellite Technology Limited, CGSTL. They are arguably the leading remote sensing company in the world. They've built and launched about 200 remote sensing satellites over the past 10 years. They operate a constellation of those satellites. They've had some interesting adventures with the Wagner Group, among other things, that have gotten them sanctioned. This company emerged from this Institute of Optics and Precision Mechanics. This Institute of Optics and Precision Mechanics has they have a venture capital arm that has invested into this company and also invested into a number of other related companies, companies building optical payloads, companies building filters for these satellites, companies building a lot of other related equipment. And again, this institute, which is allowing their technology to be transferred to commercial companies, is investing into these commercial companies. It's also being supported by the province and the city of Changchun. So you have the incentives of the provincial government, the city government, the large Chinese Academy of Sciences Institute within this city, all aligned in trying to help this local company build remote sensing satellites and other related equipment. And this is something that we've seen in other parts of China. Harbin, there's the Harbin Institute of Technology, arguably the probably 3rd or 4th top university in China. They built the robotic arm on the Chinese space station, for example. They have similar spin-offs that they've invested into, and this is creating a very clear alignment of incentives across, large parts of the subnational government. And this has impacted talent transfer because it's made it clear to typically young entrepreneurial engineers or others, that it's okay to make a commercial space company. And so the second point, we've seen a dramatic change in the way that talent has been transferred from the state to the private sector. So if we think about 10, 11 years ago, 2014, Document 60, let's say the starting point for commercial space in China, anyone in China at that time who knew how to build a rocket was working for a state-owned enterprise building rockets, right? And there was an example in 2018, the first notable example of a commercial launch company, Land Space at the time, hiring a senior launch engineer, Zhang Xiaoping, from the Xi'an Space Propulsion Research Institute. And at that time, the Xi'an Space Propulsion Research Institute, they were not amused at this. They tried to sue Land Space. They tried to sue Zhang Xiaoping. They said, quote, Zhang was most crucial to the development process and had irreplaceable talents, and argued that his departure could affect China's race to send people to the moon. At the time, the rumor in China is that this decision of whether Zhang was allowed to go to a commercial company went all the way up to President Xi Jinping, who, again, rumored said, as long as he stays in China, he can do what he wants. Now, Zhang Xiaoping, as far as I know, is still working for Land Space, so he was not prohibited from making that move. But again, it was a big deal. There were a lot of articles written about it. If we fast forward to today, there was an article a couple of weeks ago talking about which Chinese commercial launch company is the, quote, Whampoa Academy of the Chinese space sector. Whampoa Academy being an academy where a lot of early leadership from the PRC and ROC was trained. And a couple of examples that this article mentioned, you have Xu Chang, the founder of OneSpace, was originally on the founding team at Landspace. Kang Yonglai, the former CTO of Landspace, went on to found Space Pioneer. In 2024, Ge Minghe resigned from Landspace to establish his own company, Xiandeng Aerospace. Huo Liang, who founded Deep Blue Aerospace, was an early employee at OneSpace. Chen Xiaojun, former CTO of OneSpace, left the company to establish his own company. You get the point. The idea that top talent is no longer necessarily forced to stay within state-owned enterprises, and this has created a much larger pool and a much more diverse pool of people who are allowed to a certain extent, do what they want, as long as they stay in China, as the case may be. In any case, the talent and the evolution of that talent has changed dramatically over the last 10 years, and that's it's a notable change. The last point I would mention is that the central government has expanded the field where commercial space is allowed to play. So China typically is a system where companies need to ask for permission rather than asking for forgiveness. So commercial space companies really don't act unless the government tells them you're allowed to do this thing. And if we think about an example like the, quote, Chinese version of Starlink, for a long time, no one really knew what that was going to look like. In 2020, the National Development and Reform Commission, the NDRC, they added satellite internet to their list of new infrastructures, which is a list including things like industrial IoT and 5G and other digital infrastructures. That was the first sign that satellite internet was a big priority in China, but still, commercial companies really weren't allowed to enter this field because it was still pretty nebulous. In 2021, there was the establishment of China SatNet, which Brian referred to earlier, and SatNet is a fully state-owned enterprise, and it was implied that only state-owned enterprises were going to do this. But for a couple of years, for a lot of different reasons, SatNet did not make a lot of progress. And so in 2023, we saw the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology publish a report or a publication about the opening up of the satellite internet sector, which called for the, quote, coordinated opening of the telecommunications business to private capital and, quote, to promote the reform of the satellite internet business in steps and stages. This occurred in October of 2023. Within about 6 weeks, a second Chinese version of Starlink, this company Shanghai Space Sail, raised about $1 billion US. They have since launched 90 satellites into low Earth orbit for communications. And this company it's effectively a joint venture between the Shanghai government and the Chinese Academy of Sciences, but still it's not a national government company. It's a nominally commercial company. And the point being, until the national government made this proclamation, that was not going to be allowed. And so the government has made this, this progressively widened the playing field for what commercial companies are allowed to do. And just the last couple of points, and this is extended now to cargo spacecraft, where we're seeing more national government support for that. It's expanded to other areas as well. So I'm over my time. I will stop there, but thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Ms. Sampson.
Thank you. Hearing Chair Price, Commission members, and Commission staff, Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My testimony will focus on China's space diplomacy. One must first understand the way the United Nations divides space. Civil space topics are discussed in Vienna, Austria, at the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or COPUOS. Space security topics are discussed at the Conference of Disarmament in Geneva, Switzerland. China participates in statements at COPUOS that are titled the G77 in China. This group promotes technology transfer and ensuring that developing countries are not left behind in the use of space. It calls for equitable access to space, particularly low Earth orbit, regarding concerns about Western very large constellations, despite China having started launching 2 very large constellations of its own. Overall, China has a fairly consistent approach to COPUOS. It recognizes the importance of and need for space governance and works to see that its domestic activities meet international norms. As for space security, China and Russia argue that weapons placed in space pose the biggest threat and have proposed a weak and unverifiable treaty banning them, while the United States believes it is irresponsible actions and wants internationally recognized norms of responsible behavior to mitigate them. Most developing countries have tended to side with the Chinese and Russian position. China and Russia consistently cite the United States calling space a warfighting domain as evidence that it is preparing for space war. While China and Russia frequently have similar positions in multilateral space security fora, they do occasionally diverge. Last year, reports emerged that Russia is developing a nuclear warhead that could be placed in orbit, which directly contradicts the Outer Space Treaty. In April 2024, the UN Security Council voted on a resolution on weapons of mass destruction in space, which affirmed obligations to the Outer Space Treaty. The resolution was vetoed by Russia. China abstained. When this resurfaced later as a UN General Assembly resolution, it overwhelmingly passed. Again, Russia voted no, while China abstained. There is another place where China and Russia have not been in lockstep. Russia pledged in 2004 it would not be the first to place weapons in space. In 2014, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution which encouraged all states to make this commitment. This has been followed annually by similar resolutions. China has voted yes on this resolution every year and, with the exception of 2021, has also been a co-sponsor. However, it has not made this pledge. Other issues shape China's approach to diplomacy and outreach: space resources and exploration, and counter space capabilities. China believes the Outer Space Treaty is a cornerstone of legal framework on space resources and wants COPUOS to aim for unified interpretation and applications of it. China does not oppose commercial missions, but wants to make sure that they do not negatively impact scientific ones. The International Lunar Research Station is a Chinese-Russian initiative whose goal is the operation of a research station by the moon's south pole by 2035. 13 states have agreed to participate in it. The United States has its Artemis Accords, which build on principles contained in the Outer Space Treaty and apply them to lunar space activities. 53 countries have signed on to the Artemis Accords. These lunar governance frameworks can be competing or complementary, depending on how relations between the United States and China evolve and how the separate lunar programs fare. When talking about China's counter space capabilities, much is this derived from Secure World Foundation's unclassified annual report that I edit, Global Counter Space Capabilities and Open Source Assessment, the 2025 version of which was released today. China has engaged in multiple tests of technologies and capabilities that either are offensive counter space weapons or could be used as such. That said, it is unclear whether China intends to use its counter space capabilities in a future conflict or whether the goal is to deter U.S. aggression. There is no confirmed public evidence of China using counter space capabilities in current military operations. One of the questions I was given was how to balance keeping the United States' technical edge while engaging with China. The United States is in the process of hollowing out its current scientific base by cutting funds for scientific research under the Trump administration's Department of Government Efficiency efforts. This is hobbling the United States' technological edge, and if continued, will have consequences for the United States' scientific and technical base for decades. This disruption of federal funds to the U.S. scientific research community will harm U.S. innovation and competitiveness. There is a reason why the United States opted post-World War II to pour money into research. This was a way to ensure that the United States kept its competitive edge against Cold War rivals. By upending this, the United States is opening itself up to being bypassed by institutions supported with more stable funding sources, such as those being funded by the Chinese government. The same thing is happening with NASA. There is a lack of clarity about policies and programs, loss of personnel, and disarray caused by reported plans to move NASA headquarters and distribute staff to other NASA research centers. Federal grants have also been pulled back from existing NASA programs. This weakens the U.S. civil space program, as this level of uncertainty challenges NASA's mission focus. Again, this leaves an opening for China's space program to take advantage of its predictable operating environment to leapfrog the United States. There are opportunities for constructive space engagement with China on overlapping challenges. One is lunar radio communications for position navigation and timing, whose signals are fundamental for orbiting, landing, and surface operations. Engagements with China to avoid interference with each other's signals is crucial for mission assurance. As U.S. satellite operators deploy and operate their constellation, the risk of potential collisions with Chinese operators is growing. Bilateral sharing of information and coordination for operational safety is limited. On the Moon, coordination channels will be needed to mitigate concerns about human safety issues, understanding of intent, and shared hazards of lunar dust. There is one serious speed bump in the way of U.S.-China bilateral space cooperation, the Wolf Amendment. Although there is little evidence that it has affected China's domestic polities, it has given Chinese officials a pretext to deflect criticisms about its lack of engagement onto the United States. The United States has long been concerned about China's space programs. There are geopolitical issues, but China is a major space actor and cannot be ignored. While recognizing that China is a competitor, the United States can still benefit from finding ways to engage with China to maintain space stability and to promote responsible behaviors. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kavosa.
Thank you, Commissioner Kuiken, Commissioner Sims. My name is David Kavosa, and I am the president of the Commercial Space Federation, or CSF. CSF is the leading U.S.-based trade association representing commercial space. Our members represent multiple sectors of the space economy, including launch and reentry, remote sensing, spaceports, satellite comms, in-space awareness and manufacturing, commercial space stations, space situational awareness, and many more. When we talk about the space race of the 21st century, it's very different, as was noted by General Saltzman, as the previous space race with the Russians earlier. There is no one destination to win and no finish line. This must be a long-term, sustained expansion of human activity into space. It is critical for national security, economic security, and soft power diplomacy. So how are we doing in this race vis-a-vis China? The U.S. is still the global leader in space today, but the People's Republic of China is executing on their stated goal to catch up and overtake the U.S. by 2050. As I heard Commissioner Kuiken mention in his opening comments, China's ambitions have become their accomplishments in the last several years. So how is China going to do this and overtake the United States? They're going to do it by taking advantage of an uneven playing field and not necessarily play by the same rules that we govern ourselves by. It's important to note there is no Office of Management and Budget, no Congress or appropriations process that China has to deal with today, especially their commercial industry or civil industry. The PRC funds what the PRC wants to fund, and today that is space. Furthermore, the PRC has shown little respect for the environment, public safety, and space sustainability, or intellectual property for that matter. There are no independent regulators limiting the PRC or their commercial industry on what they can and can't do right now in space. A key component of China's space ambitions is building up its domestic, state-owned, and commercial space industry. Before 2014, space activity in China was only a state-owned enterprise. 10 years ago, the PRC opened the aperture and called for private investment in areas such as launch and satellite manufacturing. In just 10 years, China has made tremendous progress in doing what they said they were going to do back in 2014. There are now multiple non-government space launch enterprises in China, as has been noted, with 6 new reusable launch vehicles or rockets planned for maiden launches in 2025. China has also made significant investments in launch infrastructure, including the construction of 2 new launch pads over just the past 2 years. On the satellite side, China is accelerating the build-out of 2 LEO broadband constellations, as noted. China has constructed at least 7 new satellite manufacturing facilities in recent years, with the capability to produce thousands of satellites annually. By the end of 2024, China's filings at the International Telecommunications Union, or ITU, indicate plans for more than 150,000 satellites. It's important to note that China's expansion into LEO has not been done with consideration for principles like space sustainability. In the last 20 years, China has launched more rocket body mass into low Earth orbit that will not adhere to the 25-year disposal rule than the rest of the world combined. So our recommendations from the commercial space industry. I think we'll continue to lead as long as we thoughtfully implement policies that unleash the innovation of the commercial space sector. We suggest that the United States government set space as a national priority. The United States has recognized the value of investing in and unleashing industries of the future like AI, semiconductors, and quantum computing in order to maintain America's competitive edge. The space sector is that next critical industry of the future and in need of comprehensive U.S.-focused policy. Number 2, the U.S. should continue to buy commercial solutions to the maximum practical extent, whether that be NASA, NOAA, the Department of Defense, Space Force, or any civilian or federal government agency. Number 3, the United States needs to continue to invest in civil space programs and NASA in its budget. NASA and Congress needs to commit to sufficient funding for civil space exploration, space science, and a continued presence going after low Earth orbit, the moon, and exploration of Mars. We need to commit to the ISS transition. NASA should aggressively move out on awarding and funding new commercial LEO space stations and allowing the U.S. to maintain a presence in low Earth orbit. We must invest in spaceport infrastructure resiliency. The administration and Congress should make robust investments in spaceport infrastructure to increase U.S. access to space from multiple different locations across the United States. And we need to streamline and waive the regulatory requirements impeding that progress and that construction. Number 6, the U.S. should accelerate launch licensing reform. The Department of Transportation today, through the FAA, is the licensee for all space launch and reentry activity. And as the cadence for launch continues to increase, the licensing process has not kept up, and we need to reform. Number 7, we need to modernize remote sensing licensing reform. As noted earlier in this panel, China is moving very quickly on commercial remote sensing, and we need to keep pace here in the United States. Number 8, we need to implement a mission authorization regime that allows the Department of Commerce to immediately start licensing missions that are not already licensed by other federal regulators today. And we need to, number 9, maintain our leadership in international fora. In conclusion, the furthest humans have traveled into space since 1972 was last year on a privately funded, privately crewed expedition called Polaris Dawn. The United States commercial space industry has the innovation and the talent to maintain America's leadership in space and dominance in technology. We just need a willing partnership from the U.S. government. I thank the Commission for your attention and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Cox.
I want to thank the Commission for the opportunity to speak today. There is little doubt that China has a strategic intent to develop a robust space presence that competes with the West in all areas. There is also little doubt that China intends to hold our eroding space advantages at risk with sophisticated weapons that range from jammers that can deny virtually every part of the spectrum, on-orbit weapons that they routinely test, and direct ascent weapons that have been recklessly employed at multiple orbits and altitudes. For over 2 decades, I was part of the policy discussions, budget plans, and architecture pivots to prepare the U.S. for a contested space environment with a peer adversary like China. While our pace to address the threat is lackluster, it isn't because of a lack of leadership awareness. It is more attributable to endless policy debates that rehash old decisions, failed acquisitions, budget uncertainty, and traditional government infighting. While fixing these challenges in the DoD and the IC is important, their repair will still fail to enable the United States to compete with China in space. The reason? China is executing a much broader strategy that involves all the mechanisms of national power and a well-synchronized effort to attain global dominance. While industry innovation on the U.S. side is better than China, Chinese government innovation is greater than ours. The U.S. efforts are not well synchronized and sometimes even work at cross purposes. In short, China is playing chess and the West is playing checkers. The good news is that we've seen this approach from China before with Huawei, where they undercut and infected the global marketplace with capabilities that advance Chinese strategic interests. We can recognize these symptoms and act differently. China's objectives are clear: to create a state-controlled global network that gives them the ability to exert control over not just their own citizens, but hold the free society at risk. This is unlike the U.S. leveraging commercial technology on contracts to modernize the military or intelligence collection. This is complete alignment of military and civil activities where the goals and purposes are the same. Evidence of this alignment is not elusive. For example, commercial space companies can be seen rolling spacecraft out of PLA-owned integration and test facilities. The strategy is developed at the various highest level of government and has several key thrust areas. The first is to capture key technology. Industrial theft at nation-state scale is obvious. The Chinese internet is replete with doppelganger images of Western satellites. Their theft includes hostile takeovers of European companies to boost their high-rate manufacturing. Second is to attain key footholds in the market. One of the key footholds in the satellite business is an ITU frequency allocation. China will even buy European companies like Clio Connect to get them. Third, subsidize industry to undercut the global market. China's approach to subsidies is creative, and it aligns all levels of government from national to municipal. The subsidies are in the billions of dollars and are resulting in a massive expansion that dwarfs commercial growth in the United States. Fourth, build manufacturing at massive scales. Enabled by these massive subsidies and lubricated by an incredibly permissive regulatory environment, Chinese space manufacturing capacity has matured at light speed. 26 high-rate satellite manufacturing facilities have been built in the past 3 years. 21 launch-related companies have been established in the past 3 years, with over 7 new launch complexes. Fifth, manipulate seams in the regulatory environment. There appears to be no concern by U.S. regulatory bodies that China's opaque ITU filings may present interference problems, and U.S. regulatory bodies have not raised concerns with how its regulations slow U.S. operators as compared to their Chinese or foreign counterparts. Once U.S. filings are made, competitors, generally ones that are licensed and often funded by foreign governments, are permitted to game the U.S. regulatory process to slow each other down, inserting objections that might give a particular company, even a Chinese company, an advantage. China also overwhelms ITU standards bodies that are consensus-based by rushing the field with massive numbers of personnel to dictate the agenda. When the agenda for future forums is set 4 years in advance, those disadvantages are massive. And lastly, expand into global markets. They will undercut the price to outpace Western expansion and offer additional incentives like funded schools and highways to sweeten the deal. The United States' greatest power is the innovation and speed of its industrial base. We need a series of reforms that leverage our strengths, create a level playing field, and give DoD greater access to that innovation and speed. First is regulatory reform. Both the FAA and the FCC need to institute serious regulatory reform to maximize industry competition while keeping prudent attention to safety of U.S. citizens and the environment. Regulatory reform should eliminate ambiguous requirements, repair overlap in agency authorities, and discontinue allowing the National Environmental Protection Act to be weaponized for parochial interests instead of truly protecting natural habitats and resources, specifically in the United States. Regulatory timeline improvements. Previous attempts to streamline regulations have only created increased reporting requirements that require even larger regulatory staffs and longer approval timelines. Reform should institute a shot clock, it's March Madness, that competes with China's, offering approval relief if the timelines aren't met. We should also align our approval processes with non-US licensees. Third, we need to engage in regulatory fare to build parity with China. Reform should strengthen and align Western regulations related to theft of technology, manipulation of markets, and exploitation of international forums. Fourth, we need to create more public-private partnerships that incentivize growth of space-related launch infrastructure, space technology, and manufacturing. Fifth, create more flexible contracting and acquisition options for the DoD. Consider FAR modifications like what is being proposed by the SASC and Forged. Look at expanding the use of service-type contracts to lease commercial space capabilities. And finally, consider creating a special budgeting provisions for DoD and IC efforts that minimally modify a commercially available service. Such structures may incentivize companies to develop commercially viable capabilities at their own risk, and also incentivize the DoD and the IC to avoid requirements creep in exchange for speed. Thank you for your time.
Thank you all for your statements. We'll now move into the Q&A portion. We'll go in reverse alphabetical order, but since I have the mic and no one can stop me, I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair and go first. First question I have is for Mr. Curcio and maybe Mr. Cavosa as well, but anybody who has a view on this, I would love to hear it. Is U.S. investment in any way fueling China's private sector or commercial space growth?
As best I can tell, no, it's not. The closest thing that we would see to that is a couple of subsidiaries or no longer subsidiaries of U.S. venture capital funds. So, for example, Sequoia China, I think Matrix Partners as well, their China branch, has invested in some of the very early stages of Chinese commercial space. So back in 2015, 2016, 2017. I don't know if there's any reason for this, but we have not seen those entities invest in any of the more recent, well, any of the last 5 or 6 years, as far as I can tell, but that would be the closest we've seen to that.
Sir, the only thing I can sort of point to is perhaps mimicry, if anything, where I haven't seen cases where U.S. is investing in China, but what we are noticing is that when something gets invested in here in the United States in space, in commercial space, it doesn't take too long to see similar investments made in similar Chinese technologies soon after that. So when they see progress here, it dictates some of the things they do.
Okay. For both of you as well, and others, if you have thoughts, how is IP theft impacting China's commercial space growth as well, or either on either side of the fence there, commercial or government side?
It's not something that I can speak intelligently about. Again, going back to my previous answer, sir, we just see a lot of things when the Chinese government announce it or when commercial entities in China announce new programs, new technologies, they look an awful lot like U.S. programs and U.S. technology. So there's an assumption I make, but I'm not privy to details.
Okay.
And sorry, I have one extra.
Sure, of course.
Something comes to mind. You know, often you see in Chinese media things like a couple of weeks ago, there was an article where they tore apart a Starlink third generation terminal. And it was like they tore it all the way down to like the nuts and bolts. Some Chinese electrical engineer, and just layer after layer, and photos of really high definition photos of just, here's the terminal not torn apart, here's the first layer, here's the second layer, and then analysis of, how are they doing this, and how, what might we need to be, China need to be doing in order to build similar terminals. So you do see that with some regularity.
I'll just add to that. When I talked about doppelgangers, they are exact copies, right? The reaction wheels are all in the right spots. The phased array transmitters are all exactly the same. We see Starlink doppelgangers. We see Iridium, right? It's all across the board. And it's not just necessarily theft of a spacecraft design. Back in 2019, China bought Kuka Robotics, which was the premier German robotics firm that does automated assembly line and manufacturing. Now you see that KUKA robotics firm all over China. They have 6 KUKA robotics firms in China alone. And if you look at almost every satellite manufacturing building or rocket manufacturing building, you will see KUKA robotics there. It's hard to believe that they didn't learn very quickly by buying that company how to build a high-rate manufacturing line for satellites. Thanks.
If I could just add.
Yeah, please.
Foot stomp the mimicry. We definitely see the mimicry down to the details of design, whether that's through, theft of intellectual property or not, I can't say. But another observation, and maybe it's a question for some of the other panelists like Blaine who have more expertise in the Chinese commercial sector. But in the US, we have commercial entities that provide whole space services to the Department of Defense. And not my area of expertise, but what I see from China is you have the large state-owned enterprises and their subsidiaries that provide the bulk of the space capabilities. Yes, some newer entrants in the commercial market that are active in launch and a few niche areas. But I wonder now if we're starting to see a change, if China's government wants to have it both ways. It wants to have the advantages of the state-owned enterprises, but if it also aspires to have the same kind of commercial sector that can innovate and that can provide, space services and not just contribute to the PLA on the margins. Over.
Mr. Cox, one of the things in your testimony that stuck out to me is you said something to the effect of that the United States' greatest power is our industrial strength in this space, which is something I feel like we don't hear very often right now when we're compared to China, that we have an industrial advantage over them. So I'd be curious any more thoughts you may have on that in general, but specifically, what areas of our industrial base do you see that we are weak in, where we lack self-sufficiency in some of the important supply chains in the space industry?
Yeah, there's a lot to that question, so I'll try to unpack it in an organized way. But the first thing is, I would say, when it comes to our advantages, certainly the level of innovation is our greatest strength. And when the last subject we just talked about, it was how often they copy, right? We still innovate way faster than China. But that advantage can quickly erode once your adversary learns how to copy and copy at mass scale, right? So quantity will have a quality all its own. So if I can get as close to a capability on COM or ISR, remote sensing, but I can produce it way faster than you can, I'll take that seat, right? And so I think we have to jealously protect that advantage of our innovation and figure out more creative ways to both prevent its theft as well as to remove some of those impediments that we have to competing in the international market. I also think that we still have troubles as a former government employee of taking advantage of that innovation on the government side. You heard CSO talk about that as well, right? We have antiquated acquisition structures that are fossilized, that have taken on a lot of structure, and we need to strip some of that down so that we can take advantage of that innovation.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to my co-chair, Commissioner Kuyken.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Sims. First of all, great testimony from all 5 of you. Really appreciate you being here today. Ms. Sampson, Mr. Cavosa, Mr. Cox, one of the things I sort of heard from all 3 of you was a discussion about the ITU and sort of international institutions. One of the questions I asked General Saltzman, although not as directly now that I sort of look back at it in hindsight, is, are these institutions up for the role that they were intended to play? And I think the answer is no. So then there's always this sort of political tension between whether or not we should stay with these institutions or abandon them outright. I think the answer here is we should stay with them and probably make them more robust. But I'm sure there's some tension there that you guys are much more familiar with, and I appreciate all 3 of you just sort of quickly giving views.
So if I understand your question properly, is whether the international institutions are able to have these conversations. Is that what you're asking?
I mean, we created the ITU to manage where satellites get parked, if my sort of knowledge of their mission is correct, right?
Right.
If China just decides to ignore them, like, are there ITU police that are going to fly up to space and readjust them? Like, obviously, I know the answer to that. But, like, it seems to me that this is an institution that was created some period of time ago that has largely played the role that it was originally intended to do. But sort of the game has changed. And maybe they haven't changed with it, and maybe there's ways that we should think about it. I think Mr. Cox or Mr. Cavoso mentioned something about a 4-year cycle that I didn't, that I'm sort of not familiar with. But, like, that's the question. Does that make sense, Ms. Sampson?
Yeah. So, I mean, actually, the ITU, I would say, is more evolved than some of the other international institutions because it allows for member states, but also companies can be members as well. And so it's one of the few organizations, the multilateral fora that deal with space, that allow the commercial sector to be involved. So, and that's crucial because the commercial sector is a huge stakeholder in space, and they have a lot of effect on it. So I think actually it's important to keep part of that conversation. They do, basically they have a work group that picks the topics, and they work it 4 years ahead of time. But the U.S. is actually very involved in that too. So I don't know necessarily that the U.S. is getting steamrolled there. Actually, I would not describe that as well. And the ITU is actually taking on newer topics. They're starting to focus on space sustainability, which is crucial because if you're talking about issues that are, complicating the space environment, it's not just orbital spots, but it's spectrum usage. And so the idea of trying to manage effective use of spectrum is really helpful. And in regards to the United Nations, I mean, that's one of the few places the United States and China can actually talk about a lot of these issues. China is a big participant in both the civil space and the security space conversations, given how important space security and stability is to the future of U.S. space, the future of our national security space establishment, how our economy functions. I think it's important to have these conversations in these fora, so I would not actually advise pulling back. Thank you.
I'm not advising pulling back either. I was just sort of curious to get you you guys are subject matter experts here, curious on sort of your views on the tension points and thinking about sort of revitalizing a place like ITU.
Yeah, I'll just add, sir, that the ITU and UN COPUOS bodies are the best thing that we have, and our general feeling is that the United States government just needs to do a better job of advocating for U.S. interests in these bodies more aggressively.
I'd echo that statement. I think it's very tempting to talk about, should we just ignore it? But it really does. So these bodies do add value. I think we have to look at, really, it's two aspects. One is, well, what about our U.S. regulatory environment? The things that we can change, right? That's where we really need significant reform. Because we don't, as it relates to SATCOM, we don't enter the ITU until we get through our own, I would call, laborious process. And that's where we lose the competitive edge. When China can go straight to the ITU without waiting, and we sit there in a backlog of years to get there, that's where the disadvantage starts. I think the ITU can be productive, but the United States has to look at it like a strategic environment where you can't sit on your heels and just sort of watch things happen or allow someone who comes with more people to vote takes advantage of you because you haven't thought about that strategically. So I think we just need to think about these bodies in a more strategic, again, whole of government activity where we are trying to make sure that we advantage U.S. industry and U.S. capability.
I heard you and Mr. Cavoso make the regulatory reform comment, and I sat on the Armed Services Committee and listened to everyone always talk about acquisition reform. And as you peel back the onion on acquisition reform, a lot of times it's sort of self-deterring within the executive branch, not necessarily something that the Congress has imposed on the executive branch. In the space of regulatory reform, are the backlogs because there's not enough people? Is because people don't want to make decisions? There's always something that is holding up a process, and often it's being under-resourced, or not under-resourced in terms of dollars, or in terms of technology, or in terms of people or other things. Are these just institutions that are, sort of under-resourced, or is it something else there?
Yeah, I'll comment on behalf of industry to say that when we look at U.S. regulatory bodies, there's always a benefit to saying we can throw a little bit more money at them, more resources, more people. But then, of course, those organizations, once they're larger, might decide to create even more process and more structure and more red tape. That's unfortunately human nature. We tend to see, sir, when we look at U.S. regulatory bodies broadly defined, whether that's the FCC, the FAA, Office of Space Commerce, is they have within their power today the ability to modernize their licensing system and cut red tape and move things along more quickly. They've created at times too much process, too much structure. They've at times read a rule in the most strict sense of the word rather than a way that they can lean a little bit more towards industry side. And those are the sort of interpretations we'd like to focus on.
Thanks.
If I could just add to that.
Next question's for you, Mr. Cox.
All right, I'll just be quiet then.
Your mention of, I think it's KUKO robots, right? Reminded me of the testimony we heard in our Made in China 2025 hearing from, I think it was Liza Tobin, who used to be with SCSP. She talked about this sort of gigantic investment in advanced manufacturing that China has made. You sort of highlighted it in space. Is it as dramatic as it sounds? Has U.S. industry not made similar investments in terms of automation? Like I have actually visited most of the SpaceX facilities and have a fairly good sense of things, but like just be interested in you sort of, giving some additional views there.
Again, I don't think the issue is necessarily an imbalance of industry making the right investments. I think industry does again, pretty good job of making the investments in the right places at the right times. It's why China copies us. The issue is that China copies us. If you were out on that SpaceX floor in Redmond, did you see what the robots were that were assembling? Those are KUKO robots, right? So the fact that China bought that company, right? They learned decades of how to do high-rate satellite manufacturing by simply just doing it was a hostile takeover. They bought 95% of the company in one fell swoop at 50% over the stock price. And so with that one small investment, they recovered 10, 15 years of learning.
Mr. Kravosa, how much are American companies helping the Chinese space program?
I'm not aware today where we're helping directly the Chinese space program, other than through perhaps intellectual property theft and mimicry. I'm not aware of any place where we're helping the Chinese government today.
Thank you. I actually didn't realize I had a big red light, so I'll turn it back to Co-Chair Sims.
I just assumed you have utter contempt for the clock. That's what I said. Commissioner Stivers.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today and for your testimonies. Going back to international space governance frameworks, generally we're in the situation where the U.S. is withdrawing, rejecting, ignoring international agreements across the board and cooperation with other countries generally. But you also have China's situation where they are taking advantage of the situation diplomatically, but also has a track record of ignoring international agreements whenever it believes it's not in their interest. So in this context, how can we most persuasively, and this is a question mostly for you, Ms. Sampson, but please anyone else to jump in, how can we more persuasively make the case for the Trump administration to continue to engage in these international agreements? Is there a way or a recommendation where the private sector can more take the lead on some of these agreements, more so than they've done in the past?
I mean, I think there's power to the U.S. government maintaining its connection with the previous administration's agreements. Something like the Artemis Accords, for example, which, as I said, is how the U.S. Interprets the Outer Space Treaty principles and wants to apply them to future peaceful exploration of space. That's a huge thing. That we have 53 countries that have signed on to it. It's a declaration that this is how the U.S. views these sort of things and how we want to go moving forward. And a lot of countries like that vision. That's why there's so many more that have signed on to the Artemis Accords than have joined the International Lunar Research Station. If the U.S. decides to back out of it, I mean, that's not legally binding. It's just, a common understanding. But that sends a signal that the U.S. cannot be trusted. And that leaves, as I said before, that leaves an opening for China to reach in. China's got their space station now. I know they've volunteered to have other countries come and be astronauts in them. They're going to have that possibility after the International Space Station is gone, unless the U.S. is going to do something like that with its commercial space station, which I haven't heard anything like that. So I think it's a real concern. And then as well, China is using the opportunity to build outreach to other countries, using space as a soft power advantage and demonstrating that they can provide something. And if the U.S. is pulling back on funding internationally, that is leaving a huge gap for the Chinese to come in and do that. So again, I think it's just really short-sighted for the United States to be doing those sort of things. talking to international partners, they're very worried about whether they can even depend upon the United States anymore. And that gives China the chance to show that they can be depended upon. Thank you.
Just to add from my side, potentially trying to bridge the information asymmetry gap. There's just since November of last year, for example, we've seen the Chinese version of Starlink, this space sail, 1,000 sails constellation. They've made an MOU with Telebras in Brazil. They made an MOU with Miasat in Malaysia. We've seen China agree to bring a Pakistani astronaut to the Chinese space station. We're seeing an acceleration. We've seen China, about a week after USAID was defunded, we saw a China aid ground station unveiled in Namibia at the the Chinese embassy in Windhoek. So, making some of that clearer to the current administration, saying, look, guys, this is not, this is an accelerating trend that China's moving into not just usual suspect countries, but also some of the countries that are a little bit more neutral, if not slightly pro-US, Brazil, Malaysia, for example. It's concerning, to say the least.
Thanks. Any others? So Ms. Sampson, going back to you again, first of all, thank you for your testimony and your opposition, your persuasive opposition to scientific research cuts. It's just really unbelievably counterproductive vis-a-vis the U.S. and China's competition and our entire future. But I'd like to go into your first recommendation about the Wolf Amendment, which sets an approval process for U.S.-China cooperation on space. You say it should be, I would be supportive of the Wolf Amendment, but I'm open to be persuaded on revisions. It seems that simple dialogue between the U.S. and China could continue as long as it goes through an approval process through the FBI so that we're not sharing sensitive technology and the like. How should it be revised, and how can you make the case that bilateral cooperation between the U.S. and China would produce anything significant?
Thank you. So, you go back to why the Wolf Amendment was created in 2011. There was a couple things. There was concern about IP theft. There was concern about cyber attacks. There were concerns about China's human rights violations. And so they said, look, we're not going to prevent the United States from doing, actually, at that point, the U.S. was thinking about getting China on the International Space Station. And so they said, look, we're not going to prevent the United States from doing bilateral things with China. But basically it says, that White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the National Space Council, NASA cannot do bilateral activities with their Chinese counterparts unless you said they've notified the FBI, they've notified Congress, they've ensured they're not working on the human rights violators, and they report, a certain time ahead of time. So it's not that it prevents it, but it provides, as I said, a speed bump. It slows it down. And then you look about it and you say, okay, well, what has actually happened? A lot of U.S. institutions are actually afraid to do anything with China because they're worried that that will affect their ability to have U.S. government funding or grants. So we lose out on the opportunity of this cross-technological building. Like, during the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union worked together, had scientific outreach so they could maintain a foundation of relationship that allowed for at least some understanding and communication that can help de-escalate things if they go possibly elsewhere. And then looking at what China's space program has done, we all know China's space program has gone tremendously. This has done nothing to slow it down. It basically, all it does is it sends a sign that the United States is finding difficulty in working with the other preeminent space power. I think a lot of people don't realize, Russia is a failing space power. Their civil space program is in tatters. They don't have a commercial space program. The military space is the only thing that they really have. And so really, the U.S. is cutting itself off by not being able to coordinate, at least. We have to be able to coordinate with the Chinese. We're both launching very large constellations. We don't have any way to communicate, really, about changing when these satellites are changing positions. We're both looking at going to similar places on the moon. And that's going to be a concern in terms of lunar dust, in terms of making sure if there's any kind of interoperability for human safety, we need to be able to coordinate on these sort of things. And so I think there are missed out opportunities both in terms of how we can strengthen the U.S. space infrastructure, but also it sends a diplomatic message that the Chinese use against us to justify why they don't have to cooperate with the United States at all. And again, we keep doing our adversaries' work for them. We hand them the language that they can use as a noose around our throats. One of the other things I'll do, I know I'm over, is that one of my recommendations was that we needed to stop referring to space as a warfighting domain. we can call it a space as an operational domain. I think it makes total sense. By using space as a warfighting domain, again, we're doing our adversaries' work for them. We're saying, here's the language to portray the United States as the bad one, as the one that's weaponizing space. And then they use that in these international discussions that the United States needs to be able to make sure that we understand what responsible behavior is, to argue to other countries, to developing countries, that the United States is not acting in good faith and they shouldn't listen to us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Commissioner Brand.
Thank you. Just on the same subject, Ms. Sampson and anybody else who would be interested in answering this, it strikes me that the discussion we're having about engaging the PRC on space issues, it seems to parallel in some ways the discussions we have about engaging the PRC on a whole range of issues. So, military to military ties, where there would seem to be obvious benefits from a U.S. perspective in having these discussions. I'm curious, do we get a sense that there's a demand signal on the Chinese side for this? And is there any reason to be concerned that the PRC might take a different approach to this sort of engagement, whether as an intelligence fishing exercise or anything beyond sort of a good faith sharing of information and attempted deconfliction?
Again, if anybody else. So, China is part of these discussions at the United Nations and COPUOS. They've got a working group on lunar, on space resources that they've been part of, and they just started an action team on lunar coordination. And China is very much part of that. And so they understand there's a need to be able to deconflict a lot of these sort of things. Their participation in these working groups indicate that they understand, governance has a role to play and that they would like to be part of that, and they want to help shape that conversation. And so that's why I think it's really important for the U.S. to also participate, which we are right now, to continue to participate in these international discussions, because this is where the decisions are being made and these are where the conversations are being had. If we want to make sure our interests are looked out for, we need to be part of these discussions about space resource use and things of that nature. So I don't know if necessarily the Chinese have reached out about bilateral coordination. I think, again, they may not see it as, in the Wolf Amendment, that there's any point of doing so. But there have been bilateral discussions amongst, our DOD and Ministry of Defense and our State Department and their Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So there is some interest there. And I think, again, if you look at what they're planning for the International Lunar Research Station, they're looking at a lot of the similar things that we're trying to establish on the moon. And it makes sense. Their principles are very similar to the Artemis Accords principles because, again, they're working with the same, laws of physics. They're working with the same legal infrastructure started by the Outer Space Treaty. So they have similar interests. And I think, it'd be foolish of them not to want to coordinate with the United States because we are going to be the two lunar space powers. Thank you.
I just wanted to maybe push back slightly on the concept of stop referring to space as a warfighting domain. The importance of international cooperation and engaging the Chinese aside, that's all important. But let's remember that China also has defined space as a warfighting domain since 2015. And China's military leadership tends to exaggerate the capabilities that we have and how we might employ them. And I think we would have little chance in messaging to them otherwise. They will continue to see us as viewing space as a warfighting domain, even if we message to the contrary. Over.
I would second that view. Like, we can continue to splice our language, but it won't matter. I would also say, you asked a question specifically about military to military. I think our historical experience on that is it's inherently stabilizing if we can do it right. I think the challenge that you have, particularly on the space side with China, is making sure we make those connections at the right levels. And just as an example, when they blew up their own weather satellite that General Saltzman referenced in 2007, it wasn't abundantly clear that that was as well staffed as it would have been here in the United States. And so knowing where to plug in and who to talk to, who has the right balance of both strategic and national level policy, as well as the tactical implementation of that, is incredibly complex. And so getting it right is really important.
Just one more question. Ms. Sampson, you mentioned Russian plans to put nuclear weapons in space during your testimony, and based on what I read, I understand there was some hope in the U.S. government at that time that that would create friction with the Chinese, who might weigh in and tell the Russians this was a bad idea. Just based on your understanding, Is that a meaningful point of friction between Russia and China in the way that they view space?
I haven't seen any statements by Chinese government officials on this specifically. The only thing I can point to is, like I said, their votes in the UN and both the Security Council and in the General Assembly. It's my understanding, again, to be clear, Russia has never acknowledged that they are doing this. In fact, they've denied it. It's been U.S. intelligence that's come up and said that they understand Russia is developing the nuclear warhead with the intention of using it as an anti-satellite capacity from the EMP that would be released from a detonation. But it's also my understanding that when this was being first talked about, the U.S. did reach out to India and to China to say, "Can you talk to Russia?" Because that would, they would stand a lot to lose. And I'll point out, right now there's about 11,500 active satellites, of which the U.S. has about 8,000. Roughly, maybe a little bit more than that. China has about 1,000. Russia has about 320. Russia has a lot. I mean, they lose stuff. They've got people up in the space station, but they have a lot less to lose, whereas China and India both have invested more. But again, nothing specifically that they've said about that.
Thank you very much.
Commissioner Shriver.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Appreciate your testimony. Learned a lot. I have a specific question or two and then a general question for the panel. Dr. Al-Khairi, I might start with you and invite you to, if you'd like, to go into a little more detail on one of your recommendations. You said take a broader view, study dependencies, and try to exploit the vulnerabilities that China might have where they're dependent and mitigate risk where we're dependent. But you kept that at a pretty general level. Where might that lead us, and what are the types of things you would expect would result in such an analysis and where you'd want to invest?
Certainly. I think the notion of striving for dominance or superiority is good, but it needs to be a very nuanced discussion, particularly if we talk about specific warfighting scenarios in the Indo-Pacific, the high-end scenarios that are priorities for our government. What are the dependencies and when during a conflict? And if you are going to strive for space superiority, what does that mean? Does that mean you're going to hold all of your adversaries' satellites at risk irreversibly, instantaneously? Is it ability to hold at risk flexibly through reversible means, or if necessary, through irreversible means? What is the timelines associated with that relative to what's happening in the broader joint warfight? So I think it's really important for us to understand from a military perspective how space is contributing to our broader joint or coalition warfight and China's, and understand what those dependencies are and when, and then use that much more detailed look to be able to prioritize what are those investments in resilience that we need in the United States in order to have robust architectures to provide us the space capabilities we depend upon, like, for example, position, navigation, and timing systems. What are some of China's key capabilities? I think General Saltzman had talked about their intelligence and surveillance and reconnaissance as part of their kill chains, kill webs, kill meshes, what have you, in the Pacific. Our analysis kind of shows the same thing. I talked about China being the only country that has a synthetic aperture radar satellite in geostationary orbit. There are other ISR satellites and other parts of the kill chain that integrate with that. And so understanding what are the key dependencies there for China and be able to hold those at risk if necessary. And it's not that we will necessarily deny, degrade, or attack those capabilities. Our hope is always for deterrence.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I do think demonstrating you can hold something at risk is all about deterrence, not a desire to necessarily engage in that way. Speaking of engagement, so I wanted to pick up this point about potentially engaging bilaterally with the PRC. Having been in charge of the U.S. mill-to-mill relationship with China on a couple of different occasions, I think my enthusiasm is a bit in check on this, but I understand the points about they are engaging in international fora. They are the other major space power and an emerging one. I understand all that. So rather than try to litigate that with you, there were comments made about plugging in at the right place, the right people and basically constructing the right conversation with the Chinese bilaterally. So if we could get the right Chinese official to come visit the United States and lead a bilateral dialogue, who would it be? Or, if that's too specific, what organization do we want to plug in? And what would the agenda be, at an initial meeting or a quick follow-on meeting after the introductions?
I can't speak to who exactly would be there, but I think we'd be looking for science, scientific research, looking at exchanging information about space weather, exchanging information about orbital data, exchanging information about robotic space exploration, that sort of things. So probably the CNSA and whoever else conducts that sort of thing there. But I think just, accessing the tremendous amount of investment that they've made, I think would be strengthen the U.S. space system, and it would also be helpful from like a space traffic coordination circumstance to be able to share that kind of information. This is not secret information. One of the things that's always frustrated me for the U.S. National Security Space Establishment is it tries to classify the existence of objects in space, and basically anyone with a telescope or even a good iPhone can identify objects in orbit. It's not a secret anymore, but it's helpful to have that kind of coordination so that you're not running into each other. So I think that's where I would focus on, starting at the basic level of doing scientific data exchange and information for spaceflight safety, and allowing ways in which for the commercial operators to also share best practices that they've developed. And that'd be very helpful too.
Anybody else on that point? Anybody got an interlocutor in mind, or no?
Maybe just a couple of ideas. So I think the large non-geostationary communication constellation operators, so the SpaceSail come to mind, China Satellite Networks Limited would come to mind as well. These two companies are planning to launch thousands of satellites over the next few years. That's going to be important from space traffic management perspective. The company I mentioned during my testimony, so Charming Globe, CGSTL, they have a couple hundred satellites on orbit. They continue to launch a lot of satellites. And so again, they represent maybe 15, 20% of all Chinese satellites on orbit today. CASC, the large state-owned space conglomerate, they still represent most of China's launches today. So they're sending 60, 70 rockets into orbit per year, and that number will only go up as they start to do reusable rockets. So, those four entities, come to mind as, let's say, the most logical four in terms of just putting the most stuff up there into space. And at least two of them are nominally commercial companies, which may or may not make it a little bit easier from a Chinese side perspective, and also maybe from a U.S. perspective to have those kind of dialogues.
Thank you. May I ask one final question?
Please do.
22 seconds. I was going to do rapid fire, but maybe we'll just, whoever wants to.
No, take your time. Once Kaiken just goes wild and just blows past the time, it's anything goes.
Well, I was going to ask, let's say a miracle happened and Congress said, you can spend unlimited amount of money. Probably not going to happen in this environment, but I'll give you unlimited amount of money, but you can only spend it on one thing. What would you spend it on?
At least you made it a good question.
Yeah. Given some of the comments from General Saltzman earlier and our testimony, one of the big things we worry about on the industry side is lack of launch structure, infrastructure, and resiliency. We are very much single-threaded through two launch facilities today in the United States for the most part, and additional funding is needed to build up more spaceport infrastructure.
I'm going to cheat and give you two. One is continue the track of acquiring resilient architectures. So you don't need new money if we just continue on that. So that's how I'm cheating. But I would say space domain awareness and command and control are becoming increasingly important for space operations. And those, at least near term, probably ought to be priority areas.
Yeah, from my side, I think it's a little bit cheating as well. It's a pretty broad category, but a broader variety of commercial contracts. One thing that worries me right now in the U.S. is that we are very much a space industry that is SpaceX and Starlink, and then everyone else is pretty far behind those two. And if we look at the Chinese commercial space industry, I always say, yeah, SpaceX is far ahead of the top Chinese commercial launch company. But if we look at the number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6 commercial launch companies, it's not so clear. And then if we look at, the number 40 commercial launch company, like there is no number 40 commercial launch company in the US. Maybe there doesn't need to be one, but there's a much broader and deeper commercial space sector in China than we realize. And I fear that that's going to be a problem when we only have like SpaceX and Starlink as our two far and ahead leading companies.
I agree with Brian about SSA and Blaine about needing to deepen the U.S. commercial sector. One of the things that really struck me when the Falcon 9 stopped working last summer is just basically U.S. launch stopped for a while. And, this is commercial, this is military, and there's ripple effects down the line. But if I were given the opportunity to say, okay, Congress is going to give us unlimited resources, financial resources, focus on active debris removal. The U.S., there's no U.S. entity in charge of that. The U.S. hasn't really done a lot of that. Even the Europeans and the Japanese have invested money in doing missions that look at this sort of thing. The Space Force has done just some nominal, very small contracts, and frankly, the optics of the U.S. military space organization doing that is not great, given the dual-use nature of active debris removal. But it needs to happen. It is essential to being able to continue to utilize space, and the U.S. government should be an anchor tenant to any kind of active debris removal stuff. Thank you.
I'm going to try to cheat more than anybody at this table. I don't know if that's a competition or not. So first off, I would say we're not going fast enough in building resilient architecture. So if we want more money, we got to put more money towards it. The only real architectures that we've made resilient by design are missile warning, missile tracking, our SATCOM architectures, and we're just now starting on GPS. There's a whole host of things that we haven't touched that still have that giving China the first mover advantage that the chief talked about earlier. You can't do that without fixing launch, right? You can't proliferate without fixing launch. The second thing I do is focus on how do I hold my adversary stuffs at risk, right? The chief talked about that as well, right? We have very, very scant investments in offensive and defensive space control that can hold our adversaries' capabilities at risk. That's the second big investment, and you can't do that without SSA.
Thanks. I think I beat Kuiken in the longest Q&A of the day.
Next, our wonderful commission chair, Commissioner Price.
Thank you, and thank you all for your testimony today. This is so interesting. I wanted to start with Mr. Curcio, although you just began to answer the question. I wanted to, in response to Commissioner Shriver, I wanted to go back to your recommendations, which you put in your written testimony and but didn't get a chance to do in your spoken testimony. So the first question I was going to ask was for you to expand on the need for broader space industrial base, but you just did that. If you have anything else you want to add to that, that would be great. But I also want you to go back to your fourth recommendation about a more unified and better organized space strategy, what you would particularly see, and if you could talk about that for a moment.
Sure. So, well, thank you very much for reading the written testimony. Good to know that you do. I don't have much to add on the need for a broader space industrial base. I think that's really the idea is that, yeah, we need more than just SpaceX and Starlink. We can't just be reliant on these two companies controlled by one person. In terms of a more unified and better organized space strategy, I mean, my ignorance may be showing a little bit. I'm not so familiar with the U.S. strategy formulation process in general. I'm much more familiar with China, as it would turn out. But I see on the Chinese side a lot more national level strategies that then trickle down to provincial governments and city governments and district governments in many cases. And you, excuse me, you can see the way that national priorities are almost used as like a signaling device, where as soon as the national government says something, a lot of different entities down the chain mobilize into action relatively quickly. And relating to what I mentioned earlier in my testimony, like this provincial government and the Chinese Academy of Sciences subsidizing and providing tech transfer to this remote sensing company. I mean, that's at least in part related to national government priorities around things like digital China, they call it, which is trying to build a 3D map of China using, among other things, remote sensing satellite data. So the government saying we want to have this capability or this concept, Belt and Road being another example where they say we want to have more international collaboration, and that sort of acts as a signaling device for subnational governments and commercial companies and the state-owned enterprises to do these things. So maybe a better way of summarizing that point is just having a clearer process by which priorities made at a national government level are actually reflected in reality or in, again, states or cities or companies down the chain.
Thank you. Mr. Cavosa, the whole public-private partnership when it comes to space is just different than in what we've done in the past. Can you talk a bit about how your industry sees that partnership? What would be the perfect balance where we need to work harder? But what you would see as the balance there?
Sure. I mean, we can talk about it in the form of a couple of different customers, right? So the U.S. Department of Defense has become very reliant on commercial industry for satellite communications and remote sensing, and entirely pretty much reliant for launch. So those are good case studies where the DoD, the U.S. government Space Force, has said we're going to rely as heavily as practical on commercial and use firm fixed price contracts and competitively bid and milestone-based procurements. NASA, on the other side, on civil space, has moved out on that in a handful of areas as well, with things like commercial crew and commercial cargo contracts in the past. And they're looking at new procurements right now where they're looking at, okay, instead of building something bespoke, government only, on a cost-plus contract basis, let's look at firm fixed price. Let's look at milestones and competitive contracts. So we're trying to, just as an industry, get the entire federal government, U.S. government, to say, you don't have to build everything yourself, and that firm fixed price is a much better approach generally than cost-plus contract. When it comes to commercial industry, we can move faster, and we can provide generally, ma'am, 90% of the solution for, I would say, 50% of the cost when we're doing this sort of public-private partnership approach. So does that answer your question, or did I miss it?
Yeah, I just, well, somewhat. Just as we try and find that right balance, that's the question. And there are pros and cons on both sides. And what are we missing when it becomes all government? What are we missing when it becomes all private? The Chinese have a very different model.
They do.
So they can just sort of open the playing field in a very different way. So just trying to figure that out.
Yeah, and I would argue that based on what we're seeing, the Chinese are doing both at the same time right now, right? They have their state-owned enterprises where they are very much supporting those entities, and they've encouraged a lot of commercial entities to try to build public-private partnerships in the country and outside the country. So they are moving forward in that. And I would say overall the U.S. is doing well in public-private partnerships, but of course we're biased as commercial space. We would like every procurement pretty much to be a commercial procurement.
Anyone else have any thoughts?
Yeah, I would just amplify it to say maybe we should be looking at how China does it, because they're very, very creative. And finding more opportunities like the Space Florida Commission, right, where there's a strong partnership between the state and industry to try to bring specific industries to the state, not that much different than how China does it provincially, that some of our panel members have talked about, right? So can we create opportunities where there's pockets of investment being made that align with a national strategic objective, but bring, not that much different than China, where they have the G60 Starlink corridor, where they've focused on high-rate satellite manufacturing, right? How can we sort of mimic those operations to create centers of excellence across the country where we can draw talent, we can create industries, help work on infrastructure like launch pads and those kinds of things? I think we could do a lot more.
Anyone else?
I just wanted to add, there was some discussion about the importance of not going with a single source like SpaceX or Starlink for industrial-based reasons. But there's another thing, which is there are advantages to resilience in doing that. If you have, let's say, a communication terminal for a military platform that can not only talk to Starlink, but can talk to other commercial systems or military communication systems, that creates additional complexities for adversaries trying to degrade or deny that capability. So there's resilience benefits as well as industrial-based considerations.
All very helpful. Thank you.
All right, to the man who continues to celebrate Liberation Day even the next day, Commissioner Miller.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you. You've had excellent testimonies today. One of the things I've been very surprised by is that we spent a half a day talking about space, and I don't think we brought up the idea of critical minerals. If you go to the moon, there's a lot of critical minerals there. If we land on Mars, there's a lot of critical minerals there. I'm very interested in this issue on two different points. The first is we land on the moon, we land on Mars. Are there treaties right now that even pretend to govern what we're allowed to hoover up, what we can call our own? I know there have been. How do we handle this right now? And I'm even more interested in the second part of this question, which is half this discussion has been about how do we incentivize commercial firms to be involved in these public-private cooperations, cooperative endeavors. What are the pros and cons of allowing commercial firms to be involved in owning some of these critical minerals? Is this part of the debate right now? Is it something that's being pushed by industry? Is it a terrible idea? I'd love it if you could make us smart on one or both of these issues. And we can start with Mr. Cox, if you'd like, Mr. Kvosa, anyone who's interested in answering either of these questions.
I mean, I could just talk about the big picture. So the Outer Space Treaty doesn't really say anything about critical minerals or space resources, but Article 2 says you cannot appropriate the space or space celestial resources. And so there's been a debate internationally about what does that mean when it comes to space resource use. If you're not allowed to appropriate space, does that mean that can you use resources? The U.S.'s policy is that yes, you can. And a lot of our European colleagues have said no, you cannot. So there's been that dispute. The discussion of the United Nations Intercopus, so the legal subcommittee, they've been taking up a space resource working group where they talk about these sort of things and trying to get a common understanding. And that's why something like the Artemis Accords has been so helpful, because basically it does have a carve out and talks about space resource use and that sort of thing. As well, the Chinese, I talked about this in my written testimony, the Chinese submitted a paper to the legal subcommittee last year talking about how they saw space resource use, and they're open to it. They're open to there being civil actions on the moon, and they said, the commercial sector, they're not against it. They just would like to have some discussions, again, a common understanding about what exactly entities are allowed. And then when your question about commercial sector, there was any discussion about them being involved in this? Not necessarily, but I mean, I think that's part of the broader conversation about mission authorization. Under Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, nations are required to authorize and continually supervise the actions of their national actors. And so as we evolve our use of space and as the commercial sector is doing new things, one of the big things is they're trying to get mission authorization. I will point out a case where that was not happening, and that was actually pretty controversial. Last year, there was a U.S. commercial company, Astrobotic, was going to be going to the moon, and they were carrying a bunch of payloads with them. One of this included human cremated remains, and they were going to dump it on the moon. There are some people that found that offensive. The moon is a sacred place to some cultures, and they said, we do not want human remains there. And they said, well, hey, why isn't anyone taking care of that? Why did the U.S. government allow that? And there's no one authorized to do those kind of payloads. Right now, they're working on mission authorization. NASA doesn't have anything to say on that as a commercial sector. And so, the question is, if you're going to be having commercial companies being involved in using the space resource use, getting mission authorization clarified, who's in charge of monitoring that sort of thing and authorizing that, that's going to be key to allowing that to work. Thank you.
Anyone else?
I'll just add, sir, that critical resources, critical minerals, Moon, Mars, asteroids, these are all things that are very much, I think, in play. I think in our lifetime we will see my member companies are very interested in this sort of thing. And it's sort of unsettled in international law, I think, on where folks stand on this. As Victoria said, in Europe it's viewed one way, in the United States it's viewed another. But during our lifetime we will be seeing robots or landers on the moon, on Mars and other places, either using it for in situ resource utilization or with the hope, I'm sure, of bringing it back. And it's something that we all should be very focused on. If we don't do it, China will inevitably head down that path.
So could I say it's the consensus judgment of many of you, if not all of you, that commercial firms being incentivized by getting some sort of share of these mineral deposits is something that's advisable, or is it deserving of more consideration? Trying to get an idea of this and not just where things are going, but where things should be going.
I think where it should be going, yes.
Okay. All right. Let me move on to the next one then. Next question. General Saltzman, we had asked him earlier about quantum communications because it was one area in which the United States seems to be lagging behind the Chinese. With all this talk of public-private cooperation, is there something we could do to supercharge this cooperation in the United States in order to get back on track to compete with the Chinese on quantum satellites?
I'll take a little bit of that. Not an expert necessarily in quantum technologies, but as you're aware, sir, there are many different kinds of quantum technologies: quantum computing, quantum sensing, quantum communication. I'm not aware of anything that is preventing the U.S. from being competitive in that if it is a priority. My understanding is that, at least from a Department of Defense perspective, some of the other quantum technology areas have tended to be higher priority: quantum sensing, and followed by probably quantum computing. So, could we compete well if there was interest in it? I have no reason to think we couldn't.
Any ideas on particular ways of doing it? Or, all right, we'll continue to noodle on that.
We need a clear application. I understand what benefits that quantum communication brings. The inability to eavesdrop without it being detected and the link being broken, et cetera. I'm also aware that there are significant challenges with it. In order to do it over very long ranges, you need quantum repeater capabilities. Otherwise, you have to rely upon classic computing, and that sort of breaks the benefits, if you will. It creates nodes that an adversary will go after with cyber means, as an example. So there's still challenges that China and anyone else doing work in this area face, not that they won't eventually overcome it. But I think there has to be a clear application for it to drive the development.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Freeberg.
Thank you very much, and thanks for our witnesses. Really excellent and informative testimony. Mr. Kersey, I wanted to start with you. It sounds like you're describing sort of space industrial policy, which in many ways seems to resemble China's industrial policies in other domains. So you let 1,000 flowers bloom, let a whole bunch of companies emerge, let them sort of fight it out and compete among themselves, and then the winners emerge from that process. But I wonder, in this case, what is it exactly that's going to determine who the winners are? What makes the market? Because if it's electric vehicles, presumably it's millions of Chinese customers or potentially international customers. In this case, who's on the other side of this equation?
Thank you for your question. So I think the emergence of the broader commercial space industrial base is leading to chances to create winners and losers, as it were. So, for example, which launch companies out of the 40 or 50 might become the winners? The ones that are, I guess, winning contracts with the growing number of commercial satellite manufacturers that are typically funded by certain, provincial governments, as we talked about earlier, but and then who are doing, successful launches. So we've seen Galactic Energy is certainly the most well-established commercial launch company. They've sent maybe 18, 19 rockets into orbit, carrying something like 75, 80 satellites, and they've found a decent handful of customers that are varying flavors of commercial, and that's. The same applies if you're a satellite operator, for example. You have satellite operators that have been able to bring solutions to typically provincial governments, city governments, let's say. So remote sensing, to take an example. You've had remote sensing companies making contracts with provincial forestry bureaus or provincial agriculture bureaus to actually use their remote sensing data for various real-world applications. And I think it's happened in steps because I think there's a certain level of hesitance by provincial governments to give contracts to companies that are not proven. There's a certain chicken and egg element, but again, you've had a lot of high-level support, a lot of financial support, a lot of technology transfer, and that type of support that is all feeding into these companies that are step by step starting to actually develop real-world capabilities. So I think if we compare now to, say, 7 or 8 years ago, there's a much more well-developed market, for lack of a better term, for some of these companies to actually show off and sell and prove their services. And that process has started to lead to winners and losers. So it's been a little bit of an organic process, but obviously with a whole lot of government and other financial support.
So all of the customers in your story are Chinese, is that right?
The vast majority, yes, but there have been a limited number of international customers that have launched satellites on some of these rockets. So Oman, for example, recently launched a satellite China recently launched a satellite for Oman, I should say, and there was a Chinese commercial company involved in the manufacturing of that satellite. But yes, in general, the overwhelming majority of the demand right now is coming from China.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cox, in your really interesting discussion of this explosive development of China's space industrial base, I think in your testimony, you draw a parallel to the Huawei story. And I wanted to ask, how do you think about the implications down the line of China's development of a massive global internet space-based network? Is this going to be a space-based equivalent of 5G, where China is going to provide connectivity for maybe primarily for countries in the developing world, and is therefore going to have the potential ability to surveil, to monitor communications, maybe to interrupt those under some circumstances?
That's exactly what I'm implying. I don't know that I could have said it any better. I think I would also add that the parallels with Huawei are amazing, but they actually extend a little bit, right? Because in this particular case, as you probably recall, we had to work with our Western partners to say, hey, you may not want some of that infrastructure in your national networks because it's got a back door, right? So we had to kind of pluck it out. The difference with space is it's really hard to pluck it out, right? I mean, they're transmitting inside our boundaries. As we extend this space internet to things like direct to device, right? Like where I'm communicating via, S-band to one of these things, right? Now the network is inside the fence lines. And so if we don't consider that serious, we really should. Now, that's not to say that it shouldn't exist. But if we're not paying attention to it and we're not realizing that this is really about a strategic competition to enable access and enable access freely, then we're missing the boat.
Do you have any estimate of what the additional coverage would be? So there's some portion of, let's say, the developing world where people do have access to internet presently via the terrestrial means. How many more people are going to be added potentially by these space-based networks? Is it 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion? What's the impact of this?
Yeah, it's certainly in the billions, right? The ability to provide 200 plus megabits per second down to anywhere on the Earth, that is a huge and a necessary improvement in the lives of the global population. So having that ability to do it with thousands of satellites, that's really where the competition begins.
Last quick question. How many U.S. or Western competitors are there who are working towards providing some kind of similar service?
I'll let you answer that.
Sure. I can think off the top of my head of 5 or 6 companies today launching satellites into low Earth orbit that would rival that system. And then in addition to that, sir, there are dozens of satellite communications providers in geostationary orbit that are already in the hundreds of satellites that cover the whole Earth multiple times over. So there are many U.S. and European and Western providers today to compete.
Thank you.
Thank you all. In closing, thank you again to all our witnesses for their excellent testimonies today. You can find those testimonies as well as a recording of the hearing on our website. I'd like to note that the Commission's next hearing will focus on China's domestic energy challenges and China's growing impact on global energy markets. And with that, we are adjourned.